Have you ever wondered what truly powered the Roman Empire? We're sold a story of invincible legions, of honor, discipline, and the sheer force of will that carved out one of history's greatest dominions. But that's only half the story, the part they put on the victory arches. The uncomfortable truth is that Rome didn't just build an empire on courage, it built it on a mountain of debt, a financial engine that demanded constant, bloody expansion. Think about the sheer logistics. A single legion was nearly 5,000 men. Now multiply that across an empire. Thousands upon thousands of soldiers who needed to be fed, armed, and, most importantly, paid. Their horses needed grain, their siege engines needed timber, and the roads they marched on needed to be built and maintained. All of this carried a staggering price tag, a cost that couldn't be covered by bake sales and patriotic holidays. So how did they bankroll centuries of conquest? The answer reveals a blueprint for power and collapse that is shockingly relevant today, because the Roman war machine wasn't just an army. It was a self-perpetuating financial vortex. Once it started spinning, it could never, ever stop. In the early days of the Republic, things were simpler. The Roman army was a citizen militia, a sort of ancient national guard. If you owned land, you were on the hook to serve. It was a boyau affair. Bring your own sword. And after a brief campaign, you were expected to head back to your farm and beat that sword back into a plowshare. But as Rome's ambitions grew, its wars became longer and were fought in faraway lands. You couldn't ask a farmer to abandon his olive groves for a 3-year tour in some god-forsaken corner of Britannia. The old model was broken. Rome needed professionals. This is where the financial engineering began. The state stepped in, creating a professional standing army. It started paying its soldiers stipends. Not a fortune, but enough to secure their loyalty to the state or, more often, to their general. This led to a monumental shift in strategy. Conquest itself became the primary revenue stream. Every new province wasn't just a notch on the imperial belt. It was a new subsidiary, ripe for asset stripping. New lands meant new taxes, new mines yielded gold and silver, and entire populations were enslaved and sold off. It was a brutal but brilliant feedback loop. War paid for the army, and the army waged more war. But what happens when you're fighting a truly colossal war, like the epic struggles against Carthage? Taxes from existing provinces just won't cut it. This is where Rome got dangerously creative. The Republic began taking out massive public loans, primarily from its burgeoning financial class, the equites. Now let's be clear, these weren't feel-good war bonds bought by patriotic citizens. This was ancient venture capital. These wealthy elites were investors, and they expected a hefty return on their investment. Their ROI came in the form of high-interest payments and, more cunningly, the rights to lucrative government contracts in the newly conquered territories. Imagine this. You lend the government 1,000,000 sesterces to fund the invasion of Greece. In return, you get the exclusive contract to collect taxes there. The government needs you to collect, say, 2 million. But they don't care if you collect 3 or 4 or 5. Whatever extra you can squeeze out of the locals is pure profit. These private contractors, the infamous publicani, became fabulously wealthy, acting as a kind of privatized IRS with legions to back them up. War had officially become the most profitable business in Rome, and its shareholders sat in the Senate. Over time, this militarized economy warped Roman society. Political power shifted from statesmen to generals, who could promise the spoils of war to their legions and their backers. Senators became stakeholders in violence. It was a military-industrial complex in a toga, and the machine was always hungry. But here's the fatal flaw in any business model built on perpetual growth. What happens when you run out of things to conquer? Or when a campaign proves far more expensive than planned? The revenue stream slows, but the expenses, soldier salaries, veteran pensions, interest payments to your creditors, keep piling up. When faced with this crisis, Rome turned to the oldest and most insidious trick in the financial playbook. It started cheating. It began to debase its own currency, starting with the famously, let's say, fiscally creative Emperor Nero. the government began quietly reducing the silver content in its primary coin, the denarius. A little less silver, a little more cheap copper, and voila, you can mint more coins from the same amount of precious metal to pay your bills. Over the next 2 centuries, emperor after emperor repeated this trick, diluting the currency until the once mighty silver denarius was little more than a bronze coin with a thin, deceptive wash. Rome's solution was the original print money button. The result was entirely predictable: rampant inflation. Confidence in the currency evaporated. Meanwhile, the rich, who understood exactly what was happening, insulated themselves. Senators and equities funneled their wealth into tangible assets like vast agricultural estates, slaves, and gold, assets that held their value. The poor and the middle class, however, paid their taxes and bought their bread with increasingly worthless coins. The financial burden of endless war, once outsourced to conquered peoples, was now brought home to crush the Roman lower classes through a hidden tax called inflation. This wasn't just a military decline, it was a monetary collapse from the inside out. Now pause for a moment and look around. Does any of this sound uncomfortably familiar? Governments running deficits so large they're almost meaningless. Decades-long wars funded not by taxes, but by staggering amounts of borrowed money. Central banks engaging in policies that quietly devalue the money in your pocket to cover the shortfall. A financial class that profits handsomely from defense contracts and crisis speculation, while the public foots the bill. An economic system that seems to require constant growth, military, monetary, or market-based, just to keep from imploding. History may not repeat itself, but as Mark Twain supposedly said, it often rhymes. What Rome teaches us is that an economy built on the promise of perpetual expansion is a house of cards. Eventually, you run out of new lands to conquer, new resources to plunder, or new enemies to justify the spending. When that moment comes, the entire system, still burdened by its debts and obligations, turns inward. It begins to devour itself. The state, desperate for revenue, doesn't reform. It squeezes its own citizens harder. Heavier taxes, more currency shenanigans, more control, all while distracting the masses with bread and circuses and the elite retreat behind the walls of their fortified villas. We don't use terms like tribute and debasement anymore. We use a more sophisticated vocabulary: taxation, quantitative easing, monetary policy. But the mechanics are eerily similar. The U.S. spent over $2 trillion on the war in Afghanistan, almost all of it funded by debt. Who got those contracts? Who cashed the interest checks on that debt? And who is ultimately paying for it through the slow erosion of their purchasing power? You already know the answer. So the system is rigged, the parallels are chilling, and you might be feeling a little helpless. But before you start stocking up on canned goods and learning to barter, you need to understand the most insidious part of this entire cycle. You weren't supposed to know any of this. You were supposed to be focused on the theater, the political drama, the market fluctuations, the daily headlines. You were never meant to look behind the curtain at the machinery itself, to ask how Rome really paid for its wars, or how the modern state pays for its own. You weren't supposed to understand the incentives, but now you do, and that's the first step. True financial education isn't about learning to budget or pick stocks. It's about understanding the systems of power that shape our world. It's about recognizing the patterns, seeing through the illusion of stability, and asking the right questions. So the next time you hear about a new crisis, a new stimulus package, or a new conflict, don't just watch the news. Follow the money. Ask who lends, who profits, and who ultimately pays the price. Because if there is one timeless lesson from the fall of Rome, it's this: empires don't collapse because an enemy smashes through the gates. They rot from the inside out when the balance sheet becomes a work of fiction, and everyone is too afraid to admit the numbers don't add up anymore.